Faith and reason are essential parts of a complete human response to God. Faith should never ask us to believe anything that we know is not true. Reason should not undermine our faith in the meaning and purpose of our existence. When both faith and reason play their proper roles in our life, we may not know all the answers in life. We may not even like some of the answers that we think are true. But we ought to be able to trust in the goodness of God. Reason has a starting point. It is our own existence that we experience. Faith also has a starting point. It is the revelation of the love, compassion, and mercy of God. Revelation, however, is not a series of propositions. Revelation is instead a person. We look at our lives through the lens of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. That Jesus does not ask us to give up the quest for truth in order to believe in him. How can faith be reasonable if God can't be put in a test tube and studied? How can we claim that we know something true about God? Revelation is the answer. In order to know something true about God, he has to tell us about himself. God did not write the Bible. Instead, we believe the Bible is the inspired account of God's revelation of himself to the people of Israel, and definitively in his Son, Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ.
Christianity is founded on the reality of Christ's resurrection. If you believe that Jesus is dead and buried in a hole in the ground, please disregard the following. We Christians look at Scripture through the lens of the resurrection. It is the resurrection that is the foundation of our Christian faith. Jesus was a Jew, and his ministry on earth was to the Jewish people. To understand what Jesus did and what his life means, you must do so with the necessary backdrop of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Old Testament was written mostly in Hebrew. The New Testament was written all in Greek. Christians read the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, through the lens of Jesus the Christ. He is our teacher, both by what he said and what he did. Jesus' Bible was the Torah, the Psalms that he prayed, and the books of the prophets. What follows is the basic story of Israel told in the books of the Old Testament. What we will emphasize in the story is what the early church emphasized. Simply put, the early church emphasized that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the priest to save his people, the prophet to teach them, and the king given by God to rule creation.
The fundamental claim of Judaism is that God revealed his divine law, the Torah, to a concrete, historical people, the Jews, through the prophet Moses. The law revealed to Israel was to transform them into a holy people in order that all people might be drawn to Israel's God. The only way we learn is by contrast, namely the example of one people seen against all other possible choices. The best way to teach all peoples is through one people. What is the good of being the chosen people anyway? The Jews have been hated throughout their history. The Egyptians, the Philistines, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Christians have all taken their turn, and most recently the Nazis and the radical Islamists. Why are the Jews still here? God gets the credit. God speaks to us by example, and God is always faithful. The people of Israel had a king and a law. They had a temple and a priesthood. They had prophets and holiness. Here is an outline of the story of the Hebrew Scriptures told very briefly.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and called them good. When God created Adam and Eve, he gave them dominion over the earth. The book of Genesis recounts that God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fertile and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all the living things that crawl on the earth." The kingship that God endowed man and woman with was the care of creation and the good of the human family. Kings and queens are supposed to provide for the world and those entrusted to their care. That is the ideal. Earthly kings don't always live up to that ideal. The simple law that God gave the first man and woman was to fill the earth and subdue it. Humans are good because God said we were good, and God put us in his garden to care for it. Humans failed in this and were barred from the garden. Everyone knows the story of Adam, Eve, and the serpent. Sin rippled out from Adam and Eve's transgression, and Cain killed Abel. Fallen people built the Tower of Babel so that they could reach heaven and failed. Things got so bad, God sent a flood to destroy sinful humanity, but rescued Noah's family. But sin again began when Noah's sons saw that their father was naked. These are mythic stories from prehistory. Who knows how old they are? They were, however, the stories Jesus knew. They are a way of understanding truth through the ultimate problems of a beautiful world scarred by human evil.
Maybe the ancestral stories that follow about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are rooted in human experience. After all, everyone starts somewhere. God decided to choose a people, and so he called Abram and promised to make him the father of a great nation, with descendants more numerous than the stars in the heavens. He promised to give him a land and to make him a blessing on all nations. God changed Abram's name to Abraham, and with his wife Sarah had a son named Isaac, who in turn had a son named Jacob. Jacob was also called Israel, which means to struggle or to contend with God. Jacob had 12 sons who would be the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Because of a famine, they went to Egypt, where their brother Joseph had a good government job and took care of his family. Generations followed, and over the years, the descendants of Jacob were enslaved. After 300 years, God sent a prophet, Moses, to free his people. Moses is the first and the greatest of the Hebrew prophets. A prophet literally speaks for God. Moses spoke for God and gave the 12 tribes God's law, the Torah, and swore them to fidelity to God and the law. Moses led them through the Sinai desert for 40 years to the land that had been promised to their ancestor Abraham. Moses' brother Aaron was appointed as the priest to offer sacrifice to the people in front of the tent of meeting, which was like a movable temple. Moses died before the 12 tribes entered the promised land, and Joshua, Moses' successor, led the Israelites into the land of Canaan, and they conquered the inhabitants there. Joshua was followed by the time of the judges, who were tribal war leaders. Then the first king of Israel, Saul, was appointed by the prophets, Samuel as the king over all of Israel.
The kings of Israel are warrior kings. They all fight Israel's enemies. King Saul was followed by King David. The prophet Nathan promised to King David that his dynasty would reign forever. This is the beginning of the expectation of the great Messiah. David was followed by his son Solomon, who built the first temple in Jerusalem to offer sacrifice. It was built almost 2,000 years earlier than the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is now located on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This is one of the flashpoints in present-day conflict in the Mideast. The temple that Solomon built would have its own priesthood, following the priesthood of Aaron. The story of Israel from Abraham to Moses, Joshua, the judges, Saul, David, Solomon, and the kings that followed, through the destruction of the 10 northern tribes of Israel by the Assyrians, and then the captivity of the Judeans by the Babylonians, is a story of failure and redemption, enslavement and freedom. The modern-day Jew is a descendant of the peoples of Judah, one of the 12 tribes. Consider this background when thinking about the gospel and Jesus. Jesus spoke like a prophet. In fact, some people thought he was a great prophet like Elijah, returned from the dead. Jesus was accused of being the King of the Jews, and that was the charge placed over his head when he was crucified. Jesus said that night before he died that he was offering his body and blood for the salvation of many. An Old Testament priest offered sacrifice. Specifically, bread and wine was offered by the priest Melchizedek to Abraham in the book of Genesis. Kings rule and make laws. Priests intercede for others and make sacrifice. Prophets speak for God. This is not the last time that we will consider the Old Testament background for the New Testament. Revelation tells us something true about God and how we come to God. Remember, the Bible is a library, not a book. Revelation is a person. We read Scripture through the historical reality of the resurrection. Consider in this lesson the story of the Old Testament.